Hello. Thanks everybody for coming to this session, and thanks to the organizers of the World's Forum on Science and Democracy for including this important topic. I'm Marcy Darnovsky. My organization, the Center for Genetics and Society, is a small NGO based in California, working to ensure an equitable future in which human genetic and reproductive technologies benefit the common good. I invite you to learn more about us on our website and through our social media, and to be in touch. Today, David King and I will be talking about the prospect of creating genetically modified human beings and about the unacceptably dangerous societal threat this raises. Unfortunately, this is no longer a remote possibility. It's an urgent social justice and human rights challenge. In this conversation, a preliminary but important distinction is between efforts to use powerful new gene editing techniques to treat people who are sick, and, on the other hand, a very different matter, to control the genes and traits that we pass down to future generations. The first involves somatic genetic intervention. It targets dysfunctional cells and tissues in existing people as a form of treatment. Now, this raises important, though familiar, concerns about safety, about effectiveness, and less often mentioned about accessibility, given the million-dollar price tags that are now being set for gene therapies. But if we can get all that right, somatic genetic interventions would be a welcome development. In contrast, germline gene editing targets human gametes or early embryos. These genetic changes would be reflected in every cell of any resulting child, and in all of that child's future progeny. In contrast to somatic interventions, reproductive germline editing would pose much broader and much more consequential social, ethical, and political dangers. Now, public and policy deliberations about human germline modification have been going on since the 1980s, when it was beginning to seem as though that might be technically feasible. By the 1990s, a strong international consensus emerged that it would be ethically unacceptable and potentially socially disastrous to permit it. So dozens of countries, including nearly every nation with an advanced biomedical or biotech sector, passed laws prohibiting the creation of genetically modified humans, and a binding international treaty, the 1997 Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, did the same. The United States and China do not formally prohibit human germline modification, but in both there is soft law or indirect regulation or agency policies that to date have effectively halted those who are eager to go ahead with reproductive germline modification. The year 2013 was a turning point in this, with the invention of the gene editing technology CRISPR, which is more accurate and cheaper and easier to use than previous generations of genetic engineering techniques. Since that time, a handful of research teams in China, the United States, the UK, and Sweden have used CRISPR on human embryos. And this has led to building pressure, including from some scientists, though by no means from all, to rethink the existing widespread agreement that prohibits human germline modification. Many proponents of using gene editing in human reproduction say that it should be allowed in order to prevent the transmission of serious inherited diseases. In other words, it should be allowed for parents who carry a deleterious allele so that they can have unaffected children and eliminate the genetic disorder from their family lineage. But here's a really key point. Existing technologies, existing practices can already accomplish this. In 100% of cases where people know they risk passing on a genetic disease, they can avoid doing so in several ways. They can use sperm or eggs contributed by a third party, or they can use the embryo screening procedure known as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, which would ensure that their children were born unaffected and also would be genetically related to both members of a heterosexual couple. In other words, PGD can already achieve the aim that's supposed to justify reproductive germline editing, and this is true in all but a few extremely rare cases. Now, it is the case, and it's important to note, that embryo screening itself raises thorny ethical questions about what conditions are considered worthy or unworthy of life. But PGD is far safer and far less ethically and socially fraught than manipulating the human germline. Nonetheless, its availability often goes unmentioned in conversations about human germline modification. In a preliminary analysis that we carried out, for example, only 15% of articles about human germline modification in key US and UK newspapers even mentioned PGD. So the medical justification for reproductive germline editing is tenuous at best. It's against the law in dozens of countries. In public opinion polls, large majorities oppose it outright or are extremely wary. Many scientists, bioethicists, social justice advocates, even biotech companies working to develop gene therapies all argue that the human germline should remain off limits. And nonetheless, powerful forces are pushing human germline modification forward. For example, in 2017, just last year, the US National Academies of Science published a report recommending that reproductive germline modification should be allowed in certain circumstances to prevent the births of children with serious medical conditions. But the report doesn't adequately consider the difficulty, if not impossibility, of defining or enforcing such limits in the real world of commercial pressures, of competitive dynamics, of regulatory inadequacies. Such limits would simply not hold. In the United States, for example, regulators don't even control the so-called off-label use of drugs, and it's very hard to imagine that they could stop the off-label use of germline editing. The risk, the really big social risk, is that permitting germline modification for any reason at all would open the door for its use for every reason. It would usher in a commercial market for so-called enhancement of traits such as intelligence and athletic ability. In effect, it would give rise to a free market eugenics. Now, such scenarios don't depend on whether the enhancement that would be claimed is in fact real, and here's what I mean by that. It's important that we resist the kind of genetic determinism and reductionism that attributes complex traits like intelligence solely to genes. But there are reasons for concern anyway. First, scientists continue to make influential claims that are widely accepted about genes for IQ and genes for many other characteristics. Second, we know now that genes do significantly affect traits like athletic ability and obesity. The celebrity scientist George Church, who supports reproductive germline editing, has publicized a list of alleles that he sees as candidates for enhancement. The list includes genes for extra strong bones, lean muscles, for insensitivity to pain, for low odor production. And the media has reported these candidate alleles as super genes that scientists could someday program into the body. Perhaps most concerning is this. Consider that a market for genetically enhanced children could take hold even if the genetic alterations in fact did little or did nothing at all. At least in the United States, it's easy to imagine fertility clinics advertising genetic upgrades that would give your children the best start in life. And then the mere perception that these children were biologically improved would shape the way they were treated by family, by teachers, by peers. We know there are several studies showing that when teachers are told the IQ scores of the students in their classrooms, they begin treating them very differently from each other. Even some advocates of human germline modification acknowledge that if it were allowed to take hold, it would very likely lead to the emergence of genetic haves and have-nots, to even greater levels of inequality and discrimination than those we already live with, and to a future in which new forms of stratification would be layered on top of already existing divides. So to close, the medical justification for human germline modification is quite tenuous, and the temptation to biologically enhance future generations is profoundly dangerous. Engineering the genes of future children, which realistically means the children of the already powerful, would undermine our efforts towards social justice and human rights. Down that road, our scientific achievements would all too likely become not instruments of enlightenment and emancipation, but instead mechanisms for exacerbating inequality. Thank you.